In April 2023, an anonymous poster appeared on 4chan, claiming to be a former U.S. military contractor who had worked on classified crash retrieval programs. They described recovered non-human craft, biological entities retrieved from crash sites. A program so deeply classified, it operated entirely outside congressional oversight. Funded not by taxpayer money, but by revenue from patents on reverse-engineered technology. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody could verify it. It was 4chan. 3 months later, in July 2023, a decorated former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer sat in front of Congress, raised his hand, took an oath, and said almost exactly the same things. This is not a story about whether you believe in UFOs. This is a story about what happens when two independent sources, one anonymous, one on the congressional record, describe the same classified program in the same specific detail. And what happens to the people who talk? The thread appeared on 4chan's paranormal board in April 2023. The poster identified themselves as a former contractor, not a government employee, a contractor, who had worked on UAP crash retrieval as part of a team that responded to downed craft. They said they were posting anonymously for 2 reasons. First, formal whistleblower channels had already been used against people who tried to come forward through official means. Complaints filed, careers ended, security clearances revoked. Second, and they stated this directly, they were undergoing chemotherapy for liver cancer and believed they had limited time left. They answered questions for hours. The thread ran long. What distinguished it from standard internet UFO speculation was the internal consistency. The technical and institutional specificity of the answers held up across hundreds of questions from skeptical, hostile, and genuinely curious users. They were not vague. They described operational procedures, physical characteristics of recovered objects, biological details, the structure of the program itself, the kind of specific falsifiable claims that either come from someone with genuine inside knowledge or someone who had done extraordinary research and was building an elaborate and internally consistent fiction. Either way, what they described was about to be corroborated. The poster's most detailed physical description was of what they called an egg-shaped craft. White, smooth, approximately the size of an SUV. No visible seams, no joints, no propulsion system of any kind visible on the exterior. The surface was described as having a texture that wasn't quite metallic, something between ceramic and metal that no one on the retrieval team could identify by material. The object had markings, not random surface damage, deliberate symbols covering portions of the exterior. The poster described them as resembling hieratic Egyptian hieroglyphs in visual structure. Not actual hieroglyphs, but a symbol system with a similar organizational logic. The symbols had been photographed and studied. No one had decoded them. They did not correspond to any known human language or writing system. The poster said the craft were not stored in a single central location. They were distributed across multiple facilities, specifically to prevent any single person from having full knowledge of the program. The compartmentalization was described as extreme. Teams analyzing propulsion had no contact with teams analyzing biological material. Teams studying the exterior had no access to interior examination results. In January 2025, nearly 2 years after the 4chan thread, a U.S. Air Force veteran named Jake Barber came forward on News Nation with investigative journalist Ross Coulthart. Barber claimed to have been part of a crash retrieval program. His description of the craft, a large white egg-shaped object, no visible propulsion, no seams, approximately the size of an SUV. He had no known connection to the 4chan poster. The descriptions were functionally identical. Former U.S. Marine Michael Herrera separately described a 300-foot craft he encountered during a 2009 deployment in Indonesia, and was subsequently detained by individuals he described as men in black, who were not part of his chain of command. He said the craft was not human. He said this under his real name, on camera, to a mainstream news outlet. The biological claims in the 4chan thread are the hardest to verify and the easiest to dismiss, but they are also the claims that were most directly echoed by congressional testimony. The poster described recovered biological entities, small, gray-toned, large cranium relative to body size, consistent with decades of described gray alien accounts. The poster said the bodies showed a range of apparent aging, some appearing juvenile, some adult, which they interpreted as suggesting the entities had a biological life cycle. They described the entities as having holes where human ears would be, eyes that could tolerate high-intensity light without apparent damage, no visible digestive system in examined specimens. The poster was asked directly, "Are these extraterrestrial?" Their answer was careful. They said the program's internal working assumption was that the entities were not extraterrestrial in the conventional planetary sense. The language they used was that the entities had a relationship to space and time that didn't map cleanly onto the ET hypothesis, which aligns directly with the interdimensional framework that serious UAP researchers, including Jacques Vallée, have been advancing for decades. In July 2023, David Grusch testified before Congress under oath. His exact words: "The United States government has recovered craft of non-human origin. Non-human biologics were recovered from crash sites." He said this based on testimony from over 40 witnesses he had personally interviewed: military personnel, intelligence officials, contractors. He said he had not personally seen the craft or the biological material. He said the witnesses who had were still classified and could not come forward publicly. Congressman Tim Burchett asked directly, "Do you believe these biologics were non-human?" Grusch said yes. If the idea that the same specific classified program was described by an anonymous 4chan poster and a decorated intelligence officer under oath 3 months apart keeps you watching, subscribe. Dead Man Secrets goes this deep every single week. The most significant claim in the 4chan thread, and the one with the most institutional corroboration, was not about craft or bodies. It was about how the program is funded and why it can't be shut down. The poster described a retrieval and reverse engineering program operating entirely under private defense contractors, not directly under any government agency. The benefit of this structure is specific. Private contractors are not subject to the same congressional oversight, FOIA requests, or Inspector General investigations as government agencies. A program run through a private contractor is effectively invisible to the normal mechanisms of government accountability. The poster claimed the program was self-funding. Revenue generated from patents on technology reverse engineered from recovered craft was being cycled back into program operations, meaning the program did not appear on any government budget line and was not dependent on congressional appropriations. This is a specific, falsifiable, extraordinary claim, and in 2023 it was essentially validated by the United States Senate. Senator Chuck Schumer introduced an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, specifically designed to force private defense contractors to surrender any recovered UAP materials and data to the government. The amendment stated that any non-human intelligence materials or technologies in the possession of private entities must be transferred to federal custody. The amendment was stripped from the final bill before passage. Think about what that sequence means. A senior U.S. senator introduced legislation premised on the assumption that private contractors might actually possess recovered non-human materials. The legislation was defeated. The materials, if they exist, stayed where they were. Grusch testified that he had personally been retaliated against for attempting to bring this information through official channels. His security clearance was threatened. His career was damaged. He filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Intelligence Community Inspector General, which was found to be credible and urgent. Credible and urgent. Those are the Inspector General's words, not a conspiracy theorist's. The 4chan thread ended. The posters stopped responding. They were never identified. They had said they were undergoing chemotherapy. They had said they expected limited time. Whether they are alive, whether they were who they claimed to be, whether the thread was an extraordinary act of anonymous disclosure or an extraordinarily researched piece of fiction, none of that has been resolved. What has been resolved is this: the institutional structure they described, private contractors, compartmentalization, self-funding through reverse-engineered patents, whistleblower suppression, was described in specific detail on an anonymous message board in April 2023. Every element of that structure was corroborated, independently, by credentialed sources, under oath, in the months that followed. The egg-shaped craft with no propulsion and no seams was described in April 2023. The same craft was described by a named Air Force veteran with video evidence in January 2025. The non-human biological material was described in April 2023. A former intelligence officer said the same thing to Congress in July 2023. The private contractor program structure was described in April 2023. The U.S. Senate introduced legislation premised on its existence in late 2023. The thread is still archived. The poster is still anonymous. The program, if it exists, is still classified. An anonymous post on 4chan. A decorated intelligence officer under oath, an Air Force veteran with video, a U.S. Marine detained by unknown personnel, a Senate amendment premised on the existence of recovered non-human materials, stripped before it could pass. Every formal channel that has tried to surface this information has been shut down, stripped out, or retaliated against. The 4chan poster said they were dying. They said they posted because formal channels were closed. They said they wanted it on record. Whether they told the truth, and whether the people who followed them through official channels did the same, is a question that Congress has not answered, the DoD has not answered, and the contractors who may hold the answer are not required to speak. Drop a comment. Do you think the corroborations are too specific to be coincidence, or is there another explanation? And if you want the full breakdown on David Grusch and the congressional hearing that changed everything, that episode is next. Subscribe. Dead Man Secrets. New episode every week.